Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Joe Sutliff Sanders. He's an assistant professor in children literature at the English department at Kansas State University. And he wrote a book about classic orphan girl novels, which was published by the Johns Hopkins University. He also edited a collection of essays about The Secret Garden, which is a famous children novel and also made into a movie. He won an NEH fellowship to research children's non-fiction books. And actually now, at the moment, currently, he has a Fulbright fellowship, and he's researching at the University of Luxembourg, where he's doing research on Tintin, you know, Tintin, Kuifje, especially the occupation period during the Second World War. And he's looking in this research, he's looking at the differences between the newspaper publications and the albums during that period. Am I correct? Okay. Now, in chaperoning words, the lecture he's going to do now, he will talk about the fundamental differences between comics and picture books. I doubt if there are any fundamental differences, but maybe he'll be able to convince me. Afterwards, there will be some time to ask questions, so if you don't understand anything or if you want to ask some questions or if you disagree, you have the chance to talk to a specialist. This lecture is in English, as you noticed. I tried to learn Joe some Dutch, but he didn't get further than a duvel alstublieft. So, ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention for Joe Sutliff Sanders and chaperoning words?
Hi, thank you everyone for coming tonight. I'm really delighted to be here. Ghent has a special place in my heart, and I was touched to be invited to come speak here. So thank you for coming. Thank you to the School of Arts for having me. Thank you to Joris for putting the whole thing together. I should also thank the Fulbright Commission, not only for bringing me to Europe, to Luxembourg, but also for underwriting part of the cost for me coming tonight. So tonight I'm giving you a much reduced version of a paper that will appear this summer in a journal called Children's Literature. And that's because, as he said, my specialty is children's literature. So when I talk tonight about comics and picture books, I'm really talking about them from that perspective. And it's possible that when I'm done talking, we could think about what it would mean if we removed childhood from this equation, if we just thought about these as books for people, regardless of, you know, size, I guess. But this is my perspective, is children's literature, and that's kind of where all of this comes from. Okay, so here we go. Here's the paper. My presentation today comes from research that was driven by two high and noble forces. First, it was driven by a genuine, overflowing love for two kinds of books, very often associated with children. Comics and picture books. My love for these books and interest in any scholarship, anyone published, on either form, led me to the realization that there was a really important argument to be made about those books. The need was so obvious that I knew it was only a matter of time before someone else got around to making it. Therefore, the second force driving the research behind today's presentation was a delightful blend of terror and egoism that someone else would write this essay before I did. So that's where this research comes from. The question I pursued, and the question I'll be addressing for you tonight, is this one. How can we theorize the difference between a comic book and a picture book? Even a brief glance at the existing scholarship on comics and picture books makes clear just how hard a time scholars have had defining one kind of book without sounding like they were defining the other kind of book. For example, one study indicates that creators of picture books rely on children. Oops, I think that was supposed to come up earlier. There we go. One study indicates that creators of picture books rely on children to decode the formal tools of picture books. And another study says the same thing about creators of comics. For another example, one of the foundational papers on picture books explains how, in that form, words and image constitute separate plates, sliding and scraping along against each other. But one of the most widely read studies of comics has argued that in that form, words and images can be played against each other, creating a tension between codes that is fundamental to the art form. That same text about comics explains that words and images in comics can ironize one another, echoing not just a point, but an entire chapter of one of the foundational monographs on picture books. Elsewhere, scholars explain how both picture books and comic books work to combine high and low culture at specific historical moments. And finally, a host of scholars can argue with no sense of stepping on one another's toes that the sequential natures of their chosen forms help readers fill in gaps in a process that produces meaning. It is an unqualified mess. And yet we know that comics and picture books are different. With the exception of some provocative instances of overlap between the two, it is actually quite easy to point at one book and say with confidence that it belongs in one group and not the other. It's when we begin to theorize comics and picture books that the problem consistently comes up. But there is a method for distinguishing between the forms, one grounded in theory about how words and images interact. Central to the solution I'm proposing to the tangle of theory is attention to how each form limits the meanings possible in images, thereby encoding, enlisting, and distributing power with particular consequences for solitary and cooperative reading experiences. The first step in articulating the differences between comics and picture books is recognizing a bizarre subtractive process by which juxtaposed words and images produce meaning. This process is at work in every instance in which words and images are put together. Not only does it function in comics and picture books, it is even true of image-text combinations that do not purport to be art, such as juxtapositions of photographs and captions in newspapers or glossy advertisements in magazines. The most illuminating analysis of this meaning-making process comes from the work of, and I'm just going to say his name in American English, even though I know it's wrong, Roland Barthes, especially the first 3 chapters of The Responsibility of Forms. Over the course of these chapters, Barthes develops his argument that images are always perceived through a process that results in a narrowing of meaning. The selection of meaning according to culturally loaded signs is important not only because it helps produce meaning, but, and this point will be crucial for defining both comics and picture books, because it suppresses meaning. From Barthes' perspective, an image can and does mean far more than its producers intend. The sea of possible meanings is terrifying, sublime in the Burkean sense, that it is too enormous to be comprehended. As a result, Barthes argues, quote, "In every society, a certain number of techniques are developed in order to fix the floating chain of signifieds, to combat the terror of uncertain signs. The linguistic message is one of these techniques," end quote. When images and language appear together, they interact in ways that produce meaning by closing off the meanings that are possible. Both comics and picture books feature a mingling of language and image, and so, from a Barthesian perspective, both would be sites in which linguistic messages work to limit the sublime meaning of images. Bart is writing about word-image combinations that were designed for adult readers, and it's in the process of repurposing his theory for the study of literature for children that I would intervene with one question he had no need to ponder. To begin to tease apart comics and picture books, the two sorts of image texts with which we are concerned tonight, we must ask this question: who chaperones the words as they do their work? The words, after all, don't do anything on their own without being read. They require a reader who deciphers them and perceives their guidance in interpreting the image. Who activates those words? Who performs them? Who engages them as they make finite the previously sublime image? In theorizing adult image texts, this question doesn't matter, as the answer for any text is the same. The competent adult, proficient in language and conversant in context, this is the person who activates the words that limit the meaning of the images. But when we think about this question from the perspective of children's literature, and specifically when we think about comics and picture books, two kinds of image texts that are often associated with childhood, this question that Bart never needed to ask provides a way to slice through the tangle of theory, revealing a reliable and fertile difference between comics and picture books. In general, if the book anticipates a solitary reader who chaperones the words as they go about their work of fixing the meaning of the images, that book is a comic. If the book instead anticipates a reader who chaperones the words as they are communicated to a listening reader, that book is a picture book. It's important to realize that, with the exception of my introduction of the idea of chaperoning, this observation of the different reading situations of comics and picture books is nothing new. Melanie Gibson is probably the most recent scholar to point out that picture books tend to be read aloud by a proficient reader to what is probably most accurately called a pre-literate reader, a person who is not yet a master of the linguistic codes, but who is positioned to become so. Rather than recapitulate the scholarship supporting this assumption about how comics and picture books are read, I'll jump to explaining why the word chaperoning should be considered fundamental to how the linguistic elements of a picture book narrow the meaning of the images in this reading situation that previous scholarship has already observed. Picture books anticipate that they will be used by at least two human beings simultaneously, one of them speaking the words and looking at the images, the other listening to the words and looking at the images. When picture books are read in keeping with this design, the process by which a speaking reader chaperones the words becomes quickly obvious. Even if the speaker reads all of the words and reads them all correctly, neither of which should be assumed, the speaker inevitably performs the words in a way that narrows the meaning of the words, even as the words fix the meaning of the images. Think of a librarian who is a master storyteller performing a well-rehearsed reading to a room full of children, or a doting uncle reading a childhood favorite to a cherished niece. These speaking readers have interpretations, which is to say narrowed meaning, of the words that become evident as the words are spoken. But think, too, of the frustrated parent reading the last hack merchandising tie-in to a frustrating child. And this next slide is a joke. This is one of my daughter's favorite books, and it's terrible. It's a terrible, stupid book. You know Winnie the Pooh, of course. The original Winnie the Pooh books are actually brilliant. They're really fantastic books. This is a merchandising tie-in somebody wrote to make money, and it's crap. But my daughter makes me read it to her over and over again. When I read this to her, I have a performance of it that communicates my disdain for this book. And but even this, my point is, even this counts as a kind of performance. Let's see here. This speaking reader, too, in this case me, has an interpretation. It may be a poorly conceived, inexpertly executed interpretation, but it nonetheless shapes the words that shape the images. The distribution of agency between the speaker and the words is negotiable, and that is why I call the process chaperoning. In the process of chaperoning the words as they attempt their work of fixing the meaning of the images, the speaking reader is sometimes indulgent, sometimes intractable, but in all cases it is that speaking reader who accompanies, shapes, aids, or in countless other ways interferes with the words. The reading relationship between speaking reader and listening reader around which picture books are designed has noticeable ideological implications, some of which Perry Nodelman has already begun to explore. His close reading of picture books for very young readers explains how illustrations can instruct an infant on how to parse images in a Western tradition. Nodelman's reading touches on the sea of possible meanings that Barth identifies. For example, in the child's comprehension that one must learn to look for specific significant objects rather than do what seems to be more natural for pre-linguistic beings and give equal attention to the entire picture plane. But he goes on to point out that, theoretically, of course, hearing an adult speak those words might cause a child to search out the named object in the picture. Here, Nodelman mentions in passing what seems to me exactly the step of interpretation that makes a picture book a picture book. The word's direct interpretation of the meaning of the sublime image, and the words come to the listening viewing reader through the speaking viewing reader. Picture books are books that combine word and images, as do comics, and it is the speaking reader, as Nodelman's example illustrates, who chaperones the words as the words fix the meaning of the images. Comics, on the other hand, are for readers who read to themselves, which means that the solitary reader chaperones the words. In the same essay in which she observes that picture books are usually consumed by at least two people simultaneously, Gibson notes that comics are seen as independent reading. If we take for granted, therefore, that words do fix the meaning of images and image texts such as comics, we must also agree that the words are chaperoned by the presumably silent, solitary reader. There isn't anyone else involved in the immediate reading process. Comics, then, are books that combine words and images, as do picture books, and it is the solitary reader who chaperones the words as the words fix the meaning of the images. By watching for which reader the book anticipates as the chaperone of the linguistic messages that narrow the meaning of its images, we can begin to explain some of the more obvious differences in how the two forms are produced. The shape of picture books, for example, comes to be a function of an anticipated dual readership in which a speaking reader will chaperone the words. Picture books are often horizontal rather than vertical, and even when they are vertical, they tend to be oversized. These shapes make the sharing of picture books easier, so that a speaking reader might spread the book over 2 laps while performing the words for the listening reader. Comics have traditionally been published in magazine format and, like magazines for adults, are shaped for easy individual management rather than sharing between 2 readers. Another formal difference that grows out of this distinction is the relative durability of the 2 forms. Comics, like most magazines, anticipate a skilled reader who can absorb the narrative on first reading, which is why comics have traditionally been published in a cheap, disposable format. Picture books, however, anticipate a readership that will return to the book again and again as the listening reader learns the patterns of fixing meaning chaperoned by the speaking reader. Picture books therefore have a more durable form, for even when they are not printed in hardback, their paper stock is one that can stand up to the repeated readings that this dual audience requires. But this distinction also, and to my mind more interestingly, points to fundamental movements of power at work in the reading of comics and picture books. One of these kinds of books, picture books, has multiple simultaneous readers, and one of those readers, the one looking at the text and reading it out loud, has at least the primary opportunity to shape these words that in turn shape the images. What is at stake in each step of this process, from the narrowing of the image's meaning through the pronouncement and performance of the words, is inevitably power. The words have power over the images, and the speaker has power over the words. It is important to keep in mind that the words do not have total power over the images, and it is similarly important to keep in mind that the speaker of the words does not have total power over the words, their meaning, or how that meaning will be interpreted by the listener. But the procedure of restricting meaning is nonetheless a procedure defined by power. Therefore, the traditional reading venues for comics and picture books are based on the exercise of power, specifically of power over meaning. Picture books offer that power over the shaping of meaning to the reader of the book who speaks the words aloud, the reader usually assumed to be an adult. The implications of that structural investment of power in a proficient, probably adult, reader who is activating the picture book along with a listening, probably child, reader are far-reaching and can explain a great deal of the history and use of both comics and picture books. Take, for example, one of the remarkable historical differences between comics and picture books. Adults have found plenty of both kinds of books to get upset about, of course, as adults often do with anything that gives children pleasure. What is surprising, though, is that when picture books cause an uproar, they do so individually, not as a class. Given the fundamental similarities between comics and picture books, any glance at the history of comics shows how remarkable this difference is. When societies around the world have shown outrage at comics, they have tended to attack comics as a medium, as a form that has something wrong at the core, rather than on an issue-by-issue or even title-by-title basis. John A. Lent's overview of the international debate about the suitability of comics for children is the best summary of this tendency. Lent points to outrage over comics in Canada in the 1940s, Australia and Germany following the end of the Second World War, and the United States, Britain, Korea, the Philippines, and Taiwan in the 1950s, an infamous track record from any perspective. In the US, mid-century concern over comics led to the formation of the Comics Code Authority. And we could talk more about them later if you like. This is a really interesting body that completely changed the history of comics in the United States. The Comics Code Authority was a regulating body with enormous power to restrict the distribution of comics. The CCA's impact on American comics is difficult to overstate. Over decades and through multiple revisions, it was successful in restricting the language and content of comics across the country. But given the similarity of comics and picture books, it's significant that the country has never had a picture books code authority. Just as something in the design of comics invites the need to censor them as a class, something about picture books diverts a similar need. Adults certainly do get very upset about picture books. Nonetheless, they tend to single out individual picture books for their ire and not argue that picture books as a genre must go. Leonard S. Marcus's rich history of U.S. children's literature reveals this pattern almost inadvertently. Marcus points, for example, to the Sturm und Drang surrounding the publication of the story of Ferdinand in 1936, saying that the book became a lightning rod for political controversy among adult readers for whom the Spanish Civil War was an issue of passionate concern. Marcus quotes the book's author as saying, "It was attacked by everybody. It was called red propaganda, a bitter satire of pacifism on one hand, and a pro-fascist tract on the other." Marcus also recalls a minor outbreak of adult anxiety over The Two Reds, published in 1950, and a much more significant eruption over The Rabbit's Wedding, published in 1958. Marcus writes of The Rabbit's Wedding, interestingly skipping over The Two Reds, that not since the story of Ferdinand had a book for young children created a comparable furor. The next note Marcus makes in the history of controversial picture books is about two books published much later. Heather Has Two Mommies and Daddy's Roommate, and you can probably guess why people got upset about these books, both appearing in 1990. Marcus explains that, quote, "The two books incited the greatest public uproar over a picture book since Garth Williams' The Rabbit's Wedding, with its supposed depiction of a biracial marriage, and prompted numerous book challenges and bannings at schools and libraries around the nation," end quote. It is certainly important and telling that these books provoked such an uproar, but it is probably more revealing that they came years to decades apart, and with little sense that the people complaining about the books saw any reason to connect new complaints to old. From 1936 to 1990, Marcus registers only 4 high points of adult hysteria in America, one of which, concerning the two Reds, he either forgets or plays down in telling about the furor over the Rabbit's Wedding. And in each reported instance, the outcry was focused on individual books, not a class of books. What's more, these 4 discrete moments of outrage take place over the same decades in which the Comics Code Authority maintained its power over the entire mainstream U.S. comics industry. Outbreaks of hysteria about picture books, unlike hysteria over comics, have historically been both rare and specific. The difference between how adults complain about comics and picture books is one of the few dramatic differences between the two. And again, we can best understand that difference by paying attention to who is chaperoning the words of each form. Because picture books rely on a chaperone who is probably a caregiver, teacher, or other adult who holds some degree of power over the listening child. Picture books as a class do not require society-wide monitoring. They will be monitored individually in the moment of their reading. Because picture books anticipate an adult chaperoning the words and therefore manipulating the meaning of the book, there is perhaps an assumption that only a rare picture book could be so debasing that its corruptive potential might elude or overwhelm the capability of the adult who chaperones the words. Thus, a hue and cry can be raised to alert other adults to an especially dangerous individual picture book. But the form of the picture book has a built-in system for monitoring, mediating, and even suppressing potentially subversive messages. So there's no need to be concerned about them as a class. As the adult performs and therefore fixes the meaning of the words, those words can be manipulated, mocked, or even ignored. Viewed from this perspective, adult hysteria over comics as a group, but picture books only individually, makes some sense. Comics anticipate a child who reads without adult supervision. Picture books anticipate an adult who will monitor and fix meaning in ways that will be appropriate for child listeners. A strange consequence of how the chaperoning of words informs reactions to picture books can be found, though it is obscured, in Marcus's explanation of the controversy surrounding the two Reds. Marcus reports that, quote, "The village elders of the children's book world closed ranks around a book they considered praiseworthy, despite the very real threat of McCarthyism. But he observes that children's writers and publishers seem to have little to fear from an America otherwise willing to blacklist anyone under suspicion of communist sympathies." Marcus goes on to explain who did and did not suffer from connections with communism. He writes, "The authors and illustrators of children's trade books suffered far less for their affiliations with leftist political organizations, including even the Communist Party, than did Hollywood screenwriters, novelists, and playwrights for adults. Radio and television entertainers and backstage personnel and other arts professionals. Public school teachers and librarians," he continues, "likewise lost their jobs by the thousands on the basis of their political views and affiliations, and the authors of textbooks came under severe government scrutiny, but not the people responsible for creating the children's books that librarians purchased with public funds and that parents and grandparents gave as gifts to the children." Marcus doesn't give a thoughtful explanation for the different treatment of these groups of people, but paying attention to how these books anticipate how they will be used can provide compelling insight on why creators were left alone, even as, and this is crucial, teachers and librarians were fired by the thousands. The reason that creators of children's books were ignored may have been because then, as now, the creators of children's books were not ultimately the adults who delivered the messages of picture books to children. Similarly, the reason that teachers and librarians were given so much attention is that these were the adults entrusted with the mediation of picture books. Teachers and librarians, the people outside the home who read picture books to children, were trusted to shape the meaning of words and therefore images. And if their politics were suspect, then they had to be removed from their positions of power in the acculturating venue of picture book reading. When the authors and illustrators of children's trade books were ignored, it was because they were far removed from the actual activation of picture books. Adults whom the nation hired to assist with literacy and acculturation, however, were inevitably in the crosshairs of the witch hunt. They were the ones whom the act of reading out loud, the process of politically loaded meaning-making, had to trust. But if picture books are to be defined by how they expect to be read, so too are comics. Whereas picture books anticipate being read aloud by a proficient reader, viewer, to a preliterate listener, viewer, comics resist allowing multiple simultaneous readers. Oops, that's the thing I was supposed to put up earlier too. The process of using the words to narrow the meaning of the images is one undertaken in solitude, with only one reader chaperoning the words as the words exercise their power. Again, the difference is not incidental, it is transformative. As with picture books, the anticipated mode of meaning-making for comics dictates multiple aspects of the form. As my students love to remind me, comics are hard to read out loud. This is perhaps the most important rule there is to understanding the form of comics. Comics are, in fact, awkward in the extreme to read out loud. The multi-panel pages that comics tend to favor anticipate a reader who knows and will follow a multi-panel, a predictable pattern through the panels. The least intrusive way for a speaking reader of comics to communicate to a listening reader both the rate and order of transition between panels is through the decidedly inelegant means of pointing. Further, whereas picture books use speaker tags to make clear to a listening audience which character is attached to which bit of dialogue, comics use visual pointers, those angular objects attached to the oval of word balloons, to demonstrate who is speaking when. And that visual cue works very well for a silent, solitary reader. Again, the least intrusive way to communicate a change of speaker when reading a comic aloud is to point, a gesture that blocks part of the image and becomes increasingly cumbersome when, as often happens in comics, a speaker produces multiple word balloons within the same panel, such as here. It would be very difficult here to point to who is speaking at what point in the panel. Comics certainly can be read out loud, but they aren't designed for that use. Comics are hard to read out loud because they are designed for a solitary reader who will do the work of combining words and pictures. From this distinction also follows a host of more politically loaded characteristics of comics. Gibson, for example, has confirmed what most of us grew up knowing. Although picture books have traditionally been valued for their role in literacy, comics are often stigmatized, very often by the same teachers and librarians who praise picture books. The time-honored cliche of a child hiding a comic book behind a textbook is an eloquent image in this sense. Comics are understood to come between children and learning. As Gibson points out, this is an ironic complaint, as comics require a reader who has an advanced degree of literacy. So a child reading a comic is, ipso facto, a child who has succeeded in learning. But the reason that the cliche about comics as working against education maintains, in spite of the obvious irony, is simple. Children reading comics may be exercising literacy, but they are not doing so with a text or a mediator who will see to it that those children make meaning in ways that fit with existing adult prejudices. One adult group in America, librarians, has historically been especially opposed to the way that comics distribute power, and not without reason. Marcus's History of Children's Literature in the U.S. contains many references to comics, and one of his most reliable refrains is how librarians, who gladly recommended and bestowed awards upon picture books, historically opposed comics. Marcus writes of a long, quote, list of offenses cited by librarians in their critique of this new incursion into their domain. And that last phrase, incursion into their domain, nicely sums up the loss of power that comics represented to adults, such as librarians. And comics' incursion must have seemed especially threatening to librarians, considering how McCarthy-era paranoia revealed their vulnerability to public whim. And keep in mind that librarians found themselves vulnerable even when they were avoiding comics in favor of picture books, a form that required an adult intermediary. Comics could only have been perceived as more dangerous, as they removed the adult intermediary and handed to solitary child readers the power of chaperoning words. If librarians could lose their jobs by mediating meaning imperfectly, how much more trouble could they invite by loaning to children books whose interpretation was under no adult supervision whatsoever? Comics also represented a threat to librarians because comics refused to behave in the ways that fit with the structures that valued librarians' work. Picture books, linked with developing literacy, fit within those structures well, but comics, which Marcus reports that librarians characterized as subliterary, were presumed to oppose literacy, and therefore the librarians who championed it. In this way, comics posed a threat not only to librarians' job security, but also to the library mission of the day, a mission that picture books supported. Finally, even the physical object of the comic book, one that served a solitary, unmonitored reader well, resisted the authority of librarians. Because comics were disposable, non-durable commodities, the physical object of the comics itself placed them out of librarians' control. As objects designed to be read and thrown away, the physical object of the comic book could not survive in a public library. Indeed, a comic book's physical shape made it difficult to shelve in a public library. Picture books, however, came in shapes that could stand up on a shelf, with covers that could bear call number stickers. It's hardly surprising that librarians felt that comics were a threat. Comics appeared ill-suited for both the mission and space of the library. The fact that, according to Marcus, so many librarians viewed the popularity of comics as a threat to their own domains was not accidental, but a direct result of the fact that comics' form, content, and process of meaning-making resisted the power invested in librarians' position of authority. At the center of the distinction I'm drawing between comics and picture books, the distinction that relies on noting who chaperones the words as the words fix the meaning of the images, is power. And one last example can demonstrate how power has already informed the distinction between the two forms in the history of children's literature. Virginia Lee Burton, writing in the July-August 1941 issue of The Horn Book, made a rare and pointed case for how her newest book should be received, a picture book very few people read today. In that same year, Burton's book, today available in a new edition under Burton's preferred title, Calico the Wonder Horse, or Saga of Stewie Stinker, appeared on shelves. Calico was a strange and, as we will see in a moment, brave attempt for a picture book. With multiple panels per page, garish paper stock, a heroic horse, and a mustache-twirling villain, Calico looked like a comic that happened to have been printed on a press usually reserved for picture books. Calico is a provocative instance of overlap between comics and picture books. Similarly interesting, though, is Burton's essay, which gives an insight into how one of the field's most important creators saw picture books, especially as opposed to comics. On the surface, Burton's Hornbook essay, titled Symphony in Comics, is an amiable reflection on how excellent art, that's the symphony part, can be made from low inspiration, namely comics. But as Marcus has revealed, Burton's tone covered a chronic insecurity over what the book meant for her career. In the essay, Burton explains how her first picture book, Choo Choo, was written for her 4-year-old son, Eris, and her second picture book was written for her son, Michael, when he was about the same age. She recounts how she started her next book, planning to write it for Eris again, but the now 9-year-old boy showed no interest. Marcus, partly on the strength of interviews with Burton's editor at the time, conjectures that Eris's lack of interest sparked a significant crisis of confidence for the successful author-illustrator of children's picture books. As Burton's own sons grew beyond the picture book age, he writes, the artist grew less and less sure of her ability to communicate with young children. Marcus focuses mainly on the professional implications of Burton's crisis. But if it is true, as I have been arguing, that picture books must be defined according to their reliance on a reading relationship that provides power to adult readers in politically significant ways, there is also a more domestic crisis at risk in Burton's experience of creating her symphony in comics. When Burton felt her children losing interest in picture books, she felt herself on the outside of a power relationship to which she had been previously indispensable. And the fear she felt becomes clear both between the lines of her Hornbook essay and through the history of children's publishing that Marcus recounts. Marcus identifies something Burton herself does not say, but that her audience, and for Hornbook, that audience would have consisted largely of teachers and librarians, would have known, a truth about picture books that is tied to the chaperoning of words, as well as the role picture books are assumed to play in literacy and acculturation. When Marcus writes that Eris and Michael were growing beyond the picture book age, what he means is that they were leaving the age at which they could be expected to participate in the reading of picture books in the way that picture books are meant to be read. Already well on the road to reading, the boys were less keen to listen to a picture book, to look at the pictures and to be instructed in the ways of traditional literacy rather than exercising their existing literacy themselves. Instead, as Burton explains, her boys were passionate about comic books, a form that asks for a solitary reader. Comics, therefore, may have represented to Burton not just a professional threat, but an in-house reminder that her children were leaving her orbit, both as the creator of children's picture books and the adult who formerly engaged with her children in the loaded experience of reading picture books together. And the exclusion of Burton from her son's reading experience as they took on the role of chaperoning the words of the books they read echoes in Burton's essay. She begins by writing that, I have found out by sad experience that the best way to write or draw a book for children is to work with them. And here she is indicating the closeness inherent in the relationship between adult and child over the artistic object of the picture book. But when her son showed a decided lack of interest in her picture book project, Burton realized that comics and other serial fiction, quote, absorbed him completely, not only him, but all the other boys his age. Then, with what Marcus calls the detachment of an ethnographer, chronicling the curious practices of a remote tribal society. Oh, I lost where I was. Let's see here. I was doing such a dramatic reading, I forgot to pay attention to my page. Burton confides that, quote, here was something to look into. What was it that held them so enthralled? Comic books were like currency. They could be traded for toys. They were collected like treasures. There must be a reason for it, she wrote. Marcus's comments about Burton's detachment is meant as a joke, but it hints at a potent truth. In writing and illustrating picture books, Burton explains her role as one of closeness with children. And when she switches to talking about comics, her words make plain her sense that she is on the outside of the relationship, looking in. Burton's insecurity, as Marcus puts it, is the product of her accurate sense that comics represent a way of reading and a closed community to which she is not invited. All right, and I'm going to skip a couple points here so we have time for questions. I began today by showing the trouble that arises when theory approaches comics and picture books. Despite the obvious differences between the two, nearly all of the formal terms most commonly used to define one can also be used easily to define the other. Still, in one of the common observations about both forms, namely that words and images work together to create meaning, lies the first step in a path that distinguishes the two. That path, my path, follows Barth's proposal that images have a broad potential for meaning that is narrowed and controlled through what he calls linguistic messages. And it continues through the common observation that comics anticipate a solitary reader and picture books do not. From there, paying attention to whether the narrowing messages of a book are designed for a chaperone who is a solitary reader or a reader speaking to an audience reveals a more consistent boundary between the two forms. But that distinction has implications that are social as well as formal, because the narrowing of meaning is fundamentally an exercise of power, whether a form presents a speaking reader or a solitary reader with the role of chaperone has consequences for the social dimensions of children's literature. Those consequences manifest in the patterns of education, affection, nostalgia, and literary history in which comics and picture books participated through the 20th century. Emphasizing the performance of chaperoning that comics and picture books foresee for their readers offers a unified theory of comics and picture books that proposes a solution to the tangle of theory. Thank you. And we do have time for questions. I'll just rely on you to tell me when to shut up, okay? Does anyone want to start?
I like our first question is the discrepancy you make between picture books and comics, especially the kind of comics you show. You could easily say they've been indicated as pulp for young adults,
Right.
And there's already some kind of a difference between the ages from the forms, well, with the public. I was just wondering, as now you're doing your research in Luxembourg on Tintin and so on, it seems to me, but I don't know it, that the European comic is more linked to the traditional picture books, whereas this difference is maybe more marked in the United States.
And I think you're onto something there. What he says is that that although this argument works fine for America, it might be considerably different in Europe, where comics have more often been published in a form that looks like the form of picture books. And I think that's true. I talked about the Comics Code Authority a little while ago. The Comics Code Authority changed and badly limited what kinds of comics could be published in America. Because of the Comics Code Authority, you could not have moral complexity in a comic book. And that meant that they were going to be for children. It meant that they just weren't satisfying to adults. And so what that meant is that the history of US comics, especially starting in the 50s, is one that is always thinking of itself as for children. Whereas comics in Europe, that's not always true. And there are more complications to this. For example, we talk about Hergé's Tintin. Tintin was originally published in a newspaper. And newspaper comic strips are for a really strange audience. They're not either of the audiences I just talked about. A comic strip in a newspaper is for adults and for children. And it anticipates that both of them will read it in solitude. Not that it will be read out loud, but that a child will read it and understand it privately, and an adult will read it and understand it privately, which is completely different from what I just set up here. So yeah, this is really true. Another way you're right, I know that's a fun thing to hear, right? Let me enumerate the ways you are right. Another way you're right is that in Europe you had I don't know what the word is. In French, usually they call them album, a book, a trade publication, an album of the comics. And that's a new thing in America. That started in America in the, early 1990s. Yeah, the early 1990s. We just didn't do that. We didn't do that with comics. And what that means is that comics never had that form that could sit on a shelf, right? Which means that it won't work in a library. It was a magazine, not a book. Whereas in Europe, that's not true. That in Europe, often they would appear maybe in a collection, like the Tintin magazine of the 50s, for example. And then those individual pieces would be pulled out and put together again in a book that had just that one story all the way through. So for example, after the Second World War, Tintin appeared in the Tintin magazine, and when it was time to make the Tintin album, Hergé in his studio would pull out from each issue just the Tintin story and stick it all together. We didn't do that. We didn't do that until the 90s. And incidentally, the 90s is when comics started showing up in libraries in America. And I think that's not coincidental. I think it's because there was a book that could sit on the shelf, you know. And so the form of the book fit it. So yeah, you're right. I think that a lot of what I've been saying in here, I think it's still true for European comics. I think, though, that somebody else needs to explain exactly what the differences are. Because comics in Europe still anticipate a solitary reader, right? Comics in Europe, even if they're published in an album, don't anticipate that one person is reading it aloud to somebody else. So in that way, the similarity is still there. In fact, the woman I quoted who has made such a point out of how comics are to be read to oneself and picture books are to be read to another person is British. And so her history with comics is much more like yours than it is mine. So I think that fundamentally it's still the same for Europeans, but I'm interested in seeing where the differences are going to show up. All right, other questions?
So, Julie, shouldn't it be then meaning making in American?
Maybe it should be.
Until the 90s?
Yeah, right. Until the 90s. Right, yeah, no, you're right. It doesn't roll off the tongue if I put in all these qualifications.
Yes,
yeah, that's right.
Some principles are equal for European and American books. That's who has the power over the words, who has the power over the book.
That's right.
And there you're right.
Yeah.
But another question, I think maybe other people have the same question. Is every picture book, is it read out loud by someone?
Yeah,
that's
great question.
Okay, the son of that artist, he quit listening to the children books his mother made.
Oh yeah.
But there are children books for older children.
Picture books for older children.
Yes,
that's right.
Picture book for older children.
That's right.
That can be read in silence.
Exactly.
What do you do with that?
Yeah, exactly right. I think, so his question, to boil it down, is that there are all kinds of exceptions to this. That you know, on the whole, this is right, but there are all sorts of interesting exceptions to this, including, for example, picture books for older children. And this is true. I think what this does is this allows us to say, okay, given that this is how picture books and comics usually work, now when we see these exceptions, we can start to ask what those exceptions mean. For example, one of them is that that in the few picture books that are for older readers, there's, how can I put it? There's an anticipation in picture books for older readers that moral questions, ethical questions, emotional questions are being worked out inside the reader rather than being worked out on the page. So you get somebody, like we were talking earlier about Sean Tan, this brilliant Australian artist. He says what he creates are called picture books. He calls them picture books. And Chantan's books do exactly this. Instead of sort of having an ethical or an emotional question that is worked out in the plot of the book, he tries to kind of embed that question in the reader. So there's a reflection of the change of power that I say is taking place when you go from a pair of readers to a solitary reader. There's a reflection of that shift in power to a shift in kind of responsibility for thinking through the emotion of the story as well. So yeah, I think what we do next is we say, okay, given that this is generally right, and we know there are exceptions, what happens with these exceptions? What does it mean that they break away from the rule? And I think that there's a lot of work to be left to be done there. For example, one of the things that somebody else pointed out to me is that sometimes you have a child who can't read yet, so maybe a 3-year-old. You have a 3-year-old child who can't read yet, but has heard the same picture book over and over again. And that child can pick up the picture book and read it, right? The child will recite each page what's happening and remember when the page turns come, and then recite that page and then recite that page. And so in that case, the child is sort of reading to herself, which is what I'm saying doesn't happen in a picture book. Of course, she isn't reading to herself. What she's doing is sort of performing the performance of the adult who read the book, right? And so now we have to think about, what does that mean then? Does that mean that this child has taken on some power? Or does it mean, and this is a very, you guys know Michel Foucault? Do you ever struggle with him? He's a French philosopher from the 70s. Michel Foucault talked about discipline and about how things like a cultural work of art will try to make a reader behave a certain way. What Foucault would say about this, I suspect, and he's dead, so I can make up whatever I want that Foucault would say. What Foucault would say is that when my daughter gets out a picture book and performs it for herself, what she's really doing is modeling herself after me. That my power is actually increased in that situation, because what she's doing is practicing sounding like me. You follow me? And so, weirdly, it's a place that looks like it gives more power to children when they actually can sort of read these books to themselves. But it might be more complicated than that. It might be that, in fact, they're just sort of paying homage to me and my performance. It's very pessimistic. Yeah, go ahead.
It might be the opposite reading, maybe for the illustrators, because mostly they tend to have the idea as illustrators to be the other author as well, and giving through the images another story which the child is more able to read because he's not able to read the words. That what you say about comics is that actually it's most likely about young adults, let's say 10-year-olds to 20-year-olds, reading stories which are solitary readers. But I think what you say about picture books, they presuppose, well, a young adult has read picture books before with his parent or whatever, before being able, before being disciplined into reading comic books. So the subversity of comic books is supposed in an adult fantasy, because he's maybe more disciplined than a kid who's maybe not really listening, or because he can't read the words, he escapes maybe something of these words, and then there's not reading this. Maybe picture books, and that's maybe that can be the task of illustrators, maybe more anti-disciplinary than comics.
That's possible, that the role of the illustration in a picture book is sort of liberating for the child, because that gives the child a place to make some meaning that isn't totally limited by the words and their performance. And in fact, this is in the longer paper. The full paper is almost 50 pages long. It's insane. It's much too long. But in that paper, I talked a little bit about this, that one of the things picture books are really good at is, well, let me take a step back. One of the things children are really good at, and research suggests they may be better at it than adults, is noticing details. That adults the research suggests, and I didn't do it, so I don't know. But the adults kind of learn to stop noticing details. It's almost what we learn as we grow up is to get the big picture and not notice details. Whereas children are still paying attention to details and not understanding the big picture. Picture books tend to play to that very well. The illustrations do. What they'll do is they'll include in them little details that are designed to provide pleasure or recognition or something to a child. So for example, there's a famous picture book in America called Goodnight Gorilla, and in the background there's a red balloon that has its own story that has nothing to do with the words. And if I'm an adult reading the words, I tend not to look at the pictures very much. I'll glance at them, but I'm mainly thinking about the words. Whereas the child is focusing on that red balloon and getting a whole story that I don't see, right? So I think you're right, that there is something that illustrators have, especially really good illustrators of picture books, have found a way to kind of take advantage of the fact that while the adult is stupidly looking at the words, the child is looking over the image and finding these details. And that's another way that, because picture books are designed to be read repeatedly, they can put those little tiny details in there, trusting that maybe the details will be found on the third reading, even if they weren't found on the first reading. And in comics, that's rarely true. There's a great American poet, actually from Kansas State University. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, he's a great poet, and he talked about how in spoken word poetry, which is his specialty, in spoken word poetry, your poem has to give up all its secrets the first time through, because the listener can't go back and re-listen to it. Whereas
like a lecture.
Yeah, like a lecture. That's right. Whereas a written poem should not give up all its secrets the first time. You want a reader to go back to the poem over and over again if it's written down. I think it's the same thing that comics traditionally, and this is before albums and what we call trade paperbacks or graphic novels, a term that I hate. Before those, comics were designed to be thrown away, so they had to give up all their secrets the first time through. I'm kind of babbling now, so I'll stop. But yeah, this is I think this is profitable.
But I think one of the most interesting things I heard was the thing about power.
Yeah.
Who has the power over the words? And it made me think about, are there students here in illustration? Yes. And that makes me think about whom are they aiming at with their drawings? Because it's not only the parents who are reading out loud the text, but they are also buying the books.
Yeah.
They have the
Yeah,
power
that's right.
over the books when they buy it in the shop. And with comic books, it's different. I think comic books, it's more
Pocket money.
children
Yeah.
who decide to buy it and read it.
That's right.
So what
That's
difference does that make in style? Because parents tend to buy stylish books, and children don't care about style. They like a story, or they don't like it. So who are you making? Who are you making the drawings for? Is it for the parents who buy the books, who have or who think they must buy some kind of book because it's stylish, because it looks good on the table? Is it for the teachers? Because the teachers also have power over that. And for example, here in the School of Arts, you have an education and illustration, and the comic strip is more minor. Is a minor. So that's all about power. So who are you drawing for? Is it for the parents, for the teachers, or for the children? And that's an interesting thing to ask yourself. And what kind of influence does this have on the style and on the stories?
I definitely think that's true. One of the things about picture books, and this all ties back to what I was saying before, one of the things about picture books is that they are supposed to be keepsakes. You know, I was talking about how they're durable and comics are disposable. They are supposed to be something that lasts, and therefore the picture books that tend to sell well are picture books that are ones that you would be proud to have on your shelf for a long time. And a shortcut to making somebody proud to have that book around for a long time is to make it look artistic. Artistic in quotation mark. So to have the picture book done in oil on canvas. Oh, oil on canvas. My God, this must be real art. You know, whether or not it's whether or not somebody with a piece of charcoal is actually a more skilled artist, oil on canvas looks impressive. So that's the kind of thing that will go in a picture book. That you want to have something that looks impressive for a long time. Yeah, so there are a lot of influences this has. All right, we may have exhausted them.
So,
All right.
okay, I hope you enjoyed it. We learned something. I learned something about power, and I thank Joe for this lecture. Thank you all for coming.